Sinise, then 27 years old, went to a doctor about pain near his tailbone. The diagnosis was chordoma, an extremely rare, slow-growing cancer that forms in and around the spine. According to the National Cancer Institute, chordoma affects roughly 1 in a million people worldwide each year, and in the United States that translates to only about 300 new cases annually. There for nearly 6 years, Gary Sinise gave almost no explanation for why he had quietly stopped taking acting jobs. The man who played Lieutenant Dan in Forrest Gump, who spent 9 seasons anchoring CSI, New York, and who built one of the most respected charitable foundations in America, simply stopped showing up on screen. There was no farewell tour, no dramatic press conference, no headline explaining the disappearance. He just went home. It wasn't until 2025 and then again in early 2024 that Gary began to explain what had actually been happening behind the scenes of his family's life. A story that begins with 2 cancer diagnoses landing in the same house within weeks of each other, and ends with a father finishing his son's unfinished music after his death. To understand why Gary walked away from Hollywood at the peak of his relevance, it helps to understand where he came from in the first place. Long before red carpets and Academy Award nominations, Gary Sinise was a theater kid from the Chicago suburbs who cared more about the stage than the spotlight. In the mid-1970s, still a teenager, he helped start a scrappy theater group with friends, including a young John Malkovich, in a church basement in Highland Park, Illinois. That group became the Steppenwolf Theater Company, which grew over the following decade into one of the most influential ensembles in American theater, eventually sending several of its members, Sinise included, into film and television. His defining screen role arrived in 1994 with Forrest Gump, where he played Lieutenant Dan Taylor, a Vietnam veteran who loses both legs in combat and spends much of the film wrestling with rage, grief, and a sense that his country had discarded him. The role earned Sinise an Academy Award nomination, but more importantly, it changed the direction of his life. To prepare, he spent time talking with wounded veterans, listening to what they had actually gone through both on the battlefield and after coming home. That research didn't stay contained to the film set. Real veterans started recognizing him in public and calling him Lieutenant Dan, and instead of brushing that off as a strange side effect of fame, Sinise leaned into it. In 2003, he co-founded the Lieutenant Dan Band, a classic rock cover group that toured military bases around the world to entertain active duty troops. A few years later, in 2011, he took things further and established the Gary Sinise Foundation, a nonprofit built to support veterans, first responders, and their families on a much larger and more permanent scale than a concert tour could offer. One of its signature programs, known as RISE, builds mortgage-free, specially adapted smart homes for severely wounded veterans, complete with features like lowered countertops, widened doorways, and voice-activated systems designed to give people with life-changing injuries back some measure of independence. By the 2010s, Sinise had become something unusual in Hollywood, an actor whose off-screen work had arguably become more consequential than his on-screen career. The Gary Sinise Foundation grew well beyond the RISE housing program over the years, expanding into initiatives that provide mobility-adapted vehicles for injured veterans, scholarships for military children, relief efforts after natural disasters, and outreach to first responders and their families as well. Sinise has often said that the foundation's work never felt like charity in the traditional sense to him. It felt like an extension of the debt he believed the country owed to the people who served it. By the time his own family's crisis began, he had already spent close to 2 decades sitting with military families in hospital rooms, at funerals, and in the aftermath of devastating injuries. None of that experience, he later admitted, fully prepared him for what was coming. Then came the summer of 2018, when the stability that had defined his family for decades started to come apart. According to Sinise's own account, his wife of nearly 40 years, Moira Harris, was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer that summer. She underwent surgery to remove affected lymph nodes, followed by months of chemotherapy and radiation. Before the family had even absorbed that news, a second blow landed. Their son, McKenna, Macy's currently no cure for it. Sinise later described the tumor in almost visceral terms, saying it looked like something aggressive taking hold of his son's spine, a description that captured just how quickly the family's sense of normal life had collapsed. Within the span of a single summer, Gary went from managing a thriving charity and an active acting career to coordinating treatment for 2 family members with cancer at the same time, one of them his wife of nearly 4 decades and the other his only son. The initial tumor can often be surgically removed and the disease considered cured. But Mac fell into the smaller, harder group, the roughly 30% of patients whose cancer returns, and Mac's illness followed a pattern that doctors describe in about 70% of chordoma cases. spreads despite treatment. In September 2018 he underwent his first major operation to remove the primary tumor from his spine. Complications followed. In February 2019 he needed a second spinal procedure to address an infection, and by May of that year scans confirmed what the family had feared. The chordoma had come back and was spreading. A third major spinal surgery followed in November 2019, and then a fourth in early 2020. Each surgery bought time, but none of them offered the family a lasting resolution, and the rhythm of Mac's life became defined by scans, recoveries, and the anxious wait to see whether a tumor would return. It was that stretch, 2020, that Sinise later identified as the point where his career simply stopped mattering to him. In an interview with People published in May 2025, he explained that Mac spent 6 of the first 8 months of that year in the hospital. "That's when I stopped acting," Sinise said, adding that he told his agents and managers he could no longer leave home to take jobs. He described taking on the role of his son's air traffic controller, coordinating specialists, treatments and medications, trying to manage every detail so that Mac himself wouldn't have to carry that weight. Sinise's last screen credits date to that same year, 2020, including the film Joe Bell, the faith-based drama I Still Believe, and a supporting turn in the 4th season of Netflix's 13 Reasons Why. He has not taken an acting job since. Sinise has said that walking away wasn't a single dramatic conversation with his agents so much as a slow realization that he simply could not be 2 places at once, and that once he understood that, the decision made itself. He described the caregiving role as something closer to a full-time job than a temporary arrangement, one that required tracking specialists across the country, researching experimental treatments and managing medication schedules with the kind of precision that left little room for anything else. The repeated surgeries steadily took a physical toll on Mac that went beyond the cancer itself. As the tumors pressed against his spinal cord, he progressively lost function, and the disease eventually left him paralyzed from the chest down. For a young man who had spent his life playing music, first drums, later piano, that loss of physical control was devastating in a different way than most people might expect. Mac had started playing drums at age 9, and by adulthood he had gone on to study songwriting and composition at the University of Southern California's Thornton School of Music. He occasionally sat in as a substitute drummer for his father's band. Losing the use of his hands and legs meant losing the primary way he had always expressed himself. He did not stop trying to make music. According to Sinise, even after paralysis took away his ability to play most instruments, Mac taught himself harmonica, since it required breath control rather than fine motor movement in his hands and legs. For more complex work, he adapted. With only limited use of his right arm and some movement in the fingers of his left hand, he strapped a stylus to his hand so he could tap out notes and lyrics on a phone or tablet, and he recorded voice memos to communicate musical ideas to collaborators when he couldn't play the parts himself. He spent his final months working from his wheelchair alongside a college friend and producer, along with members of his father's band, piecing together an album from those fragments. He also continued working at the Gary Sinise Foundation as assistant manager of education and outreach for as long as he was physically able, and helped get the foundation's official podcast off the ground. Mac's illness and Moira's cancer overlapped that first summer, though their outcomes diverged. Moira's treatment succeeded, and she went into remission, cancer-free. Mac's fight stretched on for more than 5 years. In an interview later, Sinise recalled that the hardest part wasn't any single surgery but the accumulation of the fight itself. Finding doctors, chasing experimental options, and managing a disease that, in his words, had no cure. He has said he leaned on his Catholic faith throughout the ordeal, describing how his years of comforting Gold Star families through his foundation work had, without his realizing it at the time, prepared him for what his own family was about to go through. By December 2023, Mac was back in the hospital. Gary Sinise later said his son went in on December 30th and died on January 5, 2024, at the age of 33. He was surrounded by family. The funeral took place on January 23rd, a private, intimate service that the family chose to keep out of the public eye. For nearly 2 months afterward, Sinise didn't say anything publicly about his son's death at all. He and his family wanted space to grieve privately before dealing with the attention that would inevitably follow an announcement. That changed on February 27, 2024, when Sinise posted a lengthy, personal tribute to Mac on the Gary Sinise Foundation's website, and shared a photo on Instagram captioned in memory of his son. In the tribute, he wrote about how difficult it is for any parent to lose a child, and extended sympathy to anyone who has experienced a similar loss. He described Mac as an inspiration to everyone who knew him, someone who faced his illness with grace and courage. He wrote that the family found some comfort in knowing Mac was no longer suffering, even as they continued to grieve. He also connected his own new experience of loss to the Gold Star families he had spent years supporting through his foundation, saying that after meeting so many parents who had lost children in service to the country, he now understood that particular grief on a personal level. The response was immediate. Messages of condolence poured in from veterans, first responders, and fans who had followed Sinise's charitable work for years, many of whom felt like they owed him something back after everything his foundation had done for military families. In the tribute, Sinise also shared the news that Mac had managed to finish his debut album before he died. Titled Resurrection and Revival, the record went to press the same week Mac passed away. Every proceed from its sales, per Mac's own wishes, was directed to the Gary Sinise Foundation to continue supporting wounded veterans and first responders. The story of Mac's music didn't end with that first album. While going through his son's old computer files afterward, Sinise discovered a trove of additional unreleased material, including an early composition called Angel's Theme, that Mac had written years earlier as a USC student and had always intended to finish. Sinise, determined to complete what his son had started, brought together Mac's old classmates, session musicians in Nashville, and members of his own band to finish the arrangements. The result, Mac Sinise, Resurrection and Revival, Part 2, was released on November 10, 2024, deliberately timed to what would have been Mac's 34th birthday. As with the first record, proceeds go toward the Gary Sinise Foundation. Sinise has been candid that he still doesn't know if or when he'll return to acting. In that same 2025 interview he said something might come along eventually that feels right, but that it's simply harder now to leave home for extended stretches. He said he holds his daughters, Sophie and Ella, a little tighter these days, and that losing Mac reshaped what he considers genuinely important. These days he splits his time between family life and his continued work with the Gary Sinise Foundation, which he has said carries a different kind of weight for him now. For years he was the outsider offering comfort to Gold Star families who had lost a child in military service. Now, having lived through that loss himself, he says those conversations feel different. There's no need for rehearsed words when you've actually walked the same road. He also still performs occasionally with the Lieutenant Dan Band at military bases, something that connects him back to Mac directly, since his son used to sit in on drums during those shows. Sinise has said that stepping back from Hollywood was never really a dramatic decision in the way outsiders might imagine it. It was simply a father choosing day after day for years to be present for his son rather than absent for a role. He has described feeling at times like he wasn't doing enough, like he didn't know what else to try. And then, in his words, saying a small prayer, getting back up and going back into the fight. Sinise has also spoken about how his religious faith factored into all of this. He converted to Catholicism in 2010, and in later interviews he pointed to that faith, alongside his years of foundation work and his family, as one of the three things that kept him functioning through the hardest stretches. He has said that his history of comforting children who had lost a parent, and families who had lost a loved one in military service, gave him a kind of preparation he never asked for but ultimately relied on. In his words, it gave him strength, and he has said he believes he was prepared, in some sense, for the loss his own family eventually faced. Even now, Sinise remains cautious about calling his time away from acting permanent. He has acknowledged that a project could come along that feels worth pursuing, but he's also been honest that the calculus around leaving home has changed permanently. Being a grandfather has become part of that calculus too. Spending time with his grandchildren is now woven into the same daily rhythm that once revolved around Mac's treatment schedule. Sinise has said the family has settled into a quieter, more Tennessee-centered life, one built around proximity to each other rather than proximity to a film set or a studio lot. What emerges from Sinise's own account isn't really a story about an actor disappearing from public life. It's the story of a family absorbing 2 cancer diagnoses in the same summer, of a son who kept creating music even after his body stopped cooperating, and of a father who chose, without asking for credit or explanation, to spend years being present instead of visible. The acting career is still on pause. The foundation keeps building homes for wounded veterans. And 2 albums exist now that might never have been finished if Gary Sinise hadn't decided that being in a hospital room mattered more than being on a movie set.